So I have our scene loaded back in, and we have our Lily of the Valley. What I'm going to do is go ahead and rename this, just call it Grass for now. And we'll come up with a more specific naming later. Also, I'm going to go ahead and I am going to wait just a moment on naming the textures, because as we start to modify them, they will change OpenGL previews, and a couple of other things could change. So the best way to really switch these out is within the plan editor. So we're going to edit the object, and we need to start with one subset that we can change and modify. And then I'm just going to go ahead and copy and paste the texture over to the other subsets, and then what will end up happening is it'll apply one texture map to all of the subsets, and there will only be one material being used. But if you change the hooking point, it'll separate it and create a new material. So it's just a little bit of a faster setup. What we're going to do is click on the little leaf down here for new leaf petal map, and we're going to load in those textures we just created. So we have the vegetation folder automatically showing up because it was within the bitmaps folder. We're going to use the small color, and then we do need to rotate that around because most of the view leaves are pretty much going to be upside down, where the stem is going to be on top. Now we want to load in the alpha, and we do need to invert it and also rotate it. Now the hooking point looks like it should be pretty good where it's at. I'm going to just set the X to 0.5 to keep it in the center for now. And that way we don't have anything weird happening with the flexibility or the curl. We can customize that later to get some really interesting bent grass, but for now I want it to be pretty equal with this portion of grass. We're going to be creating quite a few subsets. So we can go ahead and click OK. I also want to edit the material, and I'm going to go into the function, and what is set up currently on the bump channel is a gradient, Perlin noise. What I'm going to do is increase the scale of this. Now there is no slider because this was originally created in a version prior to version 9, so some of the old nodes will show up a little different, and they won't have sliders. We're going to go ahead and set this to 10, actually 5, and the multiply by constant, which is set to 7.5. If you're working with a version of Vue prior to version 9, this isn't needed. Another change is the scale of the actual material. In Vue 9, it's going to be 1.02, and in any version prior to that, so version 8, 7, down to 5, and earlier, the scale is going to be 0.34. But they will be identical. It's just the overall scale has changed. So if you're using Vue 9 and up, Vue 9 or 9.5 or any later release, set the scale to 102, which basically just leaving it where it's at. But if you're using a prior version, set it to 0.34. But even then, you shouldn't have to change anything because those default scales should be there. And when you even load it into the newer scenes, it'll automatically be converted. So we're going to go ahead and rename this Grass Blade and 01. Also the bump, I'm going to go ahead and change to 0.02, and that is the Vue 9 value. If you're using a version 8 or prior, you'll want to set that to 0.1 in order to get the same output that I'm getting, because the bump has changed from in version 9. What used to be 1 is now 4.5, so there's a little bit of a calculation there. So if you're using Vue 8 and lower, set it to 0.1. I'm using Vue 9, so if you're using Vue 9 and up, set it to 0.02, which is what I have, in order to match it, because I don't want the bump to be all that high. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And now I'm going to copy the material and go through each of the subsets and paste it in. Now, before I go ahead and separate these into separate texture maps, I'm going to go ahead and click OK and open up the material summary. And we can see that we just have one material that is being applied to all of them. I am going to make another change, and what I'm going to do is go to the atmosphere editor, and under light, I'm going to copy the ambient light color, and under highlights of the grass blade material, I'm going to paste that color into the highlight color. I'm going to make it more dull and reduce the intensity as well. So let's go ahead and set the highlight global intensity to 33 and the highlight global size to 12%. And that should be all we need to do for the moment. You may also notice, if you're using a version other than 9, that a different mapping mode might be set. Automatic or flat vertical. Basically, the automatic mode should be flat vertical. We're using object parametric. In some cases, you'll even see object standard. Just kind of stick with the preset that you currently have in your version, and it should work out correctly. So let's go ahead and take a look at just this grass that we created. And it does look like I need to reduce the height. So I'm going to go back and edit the object, and basically the length, we'll go ahead and change that length. And if you want wider grass, you can increase the width. What we can also start doing is modifying the curl setting, which is going to basically curl or bend the shape of the leaf along the width. It can be a little erratic if you put the values too high, so just kind of pay attention to how you have it set. Just make a few modifications here. We'll go ahead and grow a new plant just to make sure everything is showing up correctly. And the other subsets I'm not going to modify just yet. They should actually be alright the way they're at for this species. And I think I will go ahead and reduce the height a little bit more, or the length. Let's go ahead and bring it down to 5. So I will go into the subsets for the trunk and branches. We can reduce the height a little bit, or the length. -80 for subset 1. I'm going to go into wind options and just change these down to 0.5. Actually, I'll take the leaves and set it to 0.3 and do 0.2 for the trunk and branches. If we need to widen it up, we can, but it should be alright like this. There's only one more thing we need to change, and that's going to be the highlight color. Now if you take a look, as we start to zoom in really close, we can see that pixelation because of that transparency map. So if you are going to end up being this close, you'll want to use the higher resolution alpha in order to make sure that you don't have those jagged edges. But we're going to mostly be far away from this. Another thing you can do to smooth that out is if we go into the grass blade material, edit the function, and select that transparency map and change the interpolation type over to bilinear. That will help smooth it out, but it's still, for the most part, going to be a little jagged. So using a higher res image is really going to be the best way to go for that. Keeping in mind that if we do switch to the broadcast render, it should anti-alias everything. It doesn't look like texture filtering is turned on, so it's not blurring it out at the moment, which is more of an animation thing that you'll start to see. But this looks like it should be good for now, because like I said, we're really not going to get that close to the grass. Good enough for a foreground, definitely. But like I said, if you need to, you can use the higher resolution version. So what I want to do now is set up the backlight color for this. And what I'm going to do is grab a color sample. I already have one set up within View, but I want to show you where I got the color from. So what I'm going to do is switch over to Photoshop really quick. Okay, so what I have here is just a photo I took just inside the grass with the light and the sun shining through it. And then I've taken our color map, the larger scale one, and I've just pasted it on top. And what I want to do is modify, and I'm using just with the adjustments panel, adding exposure within the layer. I want to be able to adjust this background image so that we can get the areas that are closer to this color green to kind of match. And then we're going to grab a sample of that highlight color or that backlight color from the lighter portions of the grass. So basically just a little bit of tweaking, and keeping in mind that this is going to be mostly our sunlight color. So actually if I take this and compare it to this blade of grass down here, if we can get that to match up fairly close, we should be able to pull out a good color. And that looks like it's pretty close within those mid-tone ranges. Because, of course, all of this grass has a lot of highlight to it, and there's also a bit of shadow, so you just got to find kind of that medium portion. So that looks like it should be good. So what I'm going to do is use the eyedropper tool and just select a brighter portion. I am using a 5x5 average for the settings, and just pulling out the area where the sun is shining through the most, and that's going to be our backlight color. So what you can do is open up the color panel and take a look at your RGB values, so 140, 163, 45. Extract the backlight within the material editor, replace that constant with a constant color, and then change that color over to that RGB value that was within the image. Now I have a couple of different ones I set up for different ranges so that I can have a little more variability depending on the scene, so that different plants change between blades. We'll be setting that up in a minute. So I've just entered in the RGB value, and I went ahead and dragged it over to the spot within my color picker, or my favorites, so that I can come back to it if needed. And for adjusting the diffuse and ambient, I'm going to wait on any of these other lighting settings until we get into the ecosystem. So just sticking with the defaults for now, because things can vary between ecosystems and, of course, just a simple setup scene like this. So we'll go ahead and just take a look. And if the backlight color isn't bright enough, what you can do is either adjust the levels within within the image and grab a new color, or it really doesn't have to be perfect. So we can just go back in, and what you can do is go to the color and increase the lume value. And that should give us a higher output, closer to that other color. I'm also working with gamma correction mode, so that's going to make a bit of a change as well to the overall look. But I'm not going to mess around with this too much, like I said, until we get really to the ecosystem. So I do want to note that I am using display gamma of 1.8. So these are the defaults: texture map 1.8, output 1.8, all the way across. So now we're ready to take this species and we can save it. So we can edit the object, and I'm just going to bump down that length, the blade height, down to 0, just one tiny change. And then going over to subset 1, maybe knocking that down a little bit. We could also set up gnarl in order to add a little more variation, change the angle, and this subset doesn't have as big of an impact as subset 0 does, where we can gnarl it a lot. Keep it in mind, we can change both of them at the same time too. So we'll stick with that. Go ahead and shorten it, decrease the diameter of both subsets a little. Those are just the bottom stems. And we haven't set up any custom per individual leaf image maps or changes yet. But I still want to save out the species as sort of a common, quicker rendering, one material grass. So we're going to go up to the top here to Save Plant Species. Also making sure that our wind options are set where they were before, because if you grew a new plant, it will reset those values. So we're going to save a new plant species. Now I have a folder set up for personal. I would suggest placing this in your plants directory, really to increase the compatibility between systems for when you're moving projects across networks or between clients. It does make Vue accept the content license much better without any bugs or image errors or anything else. I am going to set up a folder within this folder because, unfortunately, the cornucopia content has flooded this folder with basically just the previews that you see when you're displaying cornucopia content. And you could even see some of my products in there as well. But it does make it really confusing to find out which maps are which. So we're going to create a new folder. And we're going to call this just grass. And we'll rename this Grass A01. And the same thing for the title. And I'm going to go ahead and delete this description. If you want to reference where it came from, it's a good idea to know the original source plant. So type in source and lily of the valley. So that way, if you need to make changes or there's any problem with content, you know what the source is. What we also want to do is incorporate the texture maps and go ahead and save it out. If you want to go ahead and modify the width of the blade, it does look like some of them are a bit wider than I had intended. So what I can do is curl it. We'll go ahead and set that to -140. Let's set the flexibility to 2, randomness to -10, or actually we'll go ahead and use 5. We'll add a little randomness to it. With -47. Click OK. And this is going to be a lot thinner of a grass. Should look a little better now. And then we can save over that other species if needed. I do want to note that sometimes when you rewrite over species, it can cause problems. So if you do want to just create an entirely new file, sometimes that can be a better method. That really is somewhat system dependent. I have noticed file sizes do change drastically when you save over. So I can show you that And actually, I'm looking at the file size right now, and because it is saved within the View Content folder, the file size is actually very small. With certain trees and other content, once you start saving outside the content directory, the file sizes can sometimes jump up to 20, 30 megabytes. And if you rewrite over it, it references itself within the other directory, and the file size becomes pretty much just the images, and that can cause issues between systems. So as long as we're saving within the content directory, we should be okay. But I will go ahead and just save this as a thinner type of grass. Maybe add a little more flexibility to it to prevent some of those straight up and down grass blades. We do want a few, but not a whole bunch. Make sure the wind is still set properly. Let's call it AO2. And before we make any more modifications, I want to start setting this up with the ecosystem scene in order to, catch any problems ahead of time before making a whole bunch of plants and having maybe something that's off. And since we're kind of moving from the same species to begin with, it's a good idea for us now to start working on the other scene. So I'm going to go ahead and save this scene out. And create a new scene. Actually, what I'm going to go ahead and do is close this one first, File, New, and then go to File and Options and set our unit to 1. View unit is 1 meter. Apply the settings to the new scene. And we're going to create a standard terrain and go ahead and change the scale to 10 meters by 10 meters, and then we'll do 20 centimeters for the height. And now our navigation is going to be a lot more touchy because we're working with a larger unit. So if you need to, you can use the camera control center on the right, hold down the control key, and it will slow down the camera control. Go ahead and raise that up a little bit above. Maybe we'll go ahead and set that to 0.4. A little bit of variation. Yeah, 0.3. And what I'm going to do now is load in a material for this. And what we're going to choose is, if we go to landscapes, terrascapes. Now this is going to be only available for View 9 users. Version 8, you'll have to pick a different dirt material. So I'm going to check soil. Just use this soil material. We're going to make a few changes to it. Go ahead and edit the material. And I'm going to go over to the bump and set that to depth of 2. Go to edit the function, go to fractal colors, and just modify a few of these colors a little bit. Not too many changes. And we will be modifying this color further once we start getting the ecosystem going. Okay, so just as a base, that's going to work. Alright. So let's go ahead and select ecosystem, add in a plant, and we're going to see our new grass directory here. And then we're going to go ahead and add the AO1 plant. And we can go ahead and just add both of them for now, just because we're checking them out and see how well they're going to work. And our scale at 0.1 is exactly what we want, because we worked in an internal unit of 0.1 when we created them. And I also want to note that you do need to make sure that you have, under General Preferences, Object Options, Preserve Size of Natural Elements at Creation. That does help, and is really important for making sure that the plant sizes match up and that this is relative to the internal unit. That's the way pretty much all the plants are set up, so it's really a good way of working. What we do is just go ahead and we can populate it. I'm going to turn off Decay Near Foreign Objects. And let's just take a look at this grass. Maybe thin it up a little bit. Change our maximum size variation to 0.3. Let's just render a final. So it looks like everything's working out really well so far. This is more of the even type grass that we're going to have. We're going to create some more erratic ones and some better fillers for this. But for now, it's looking good with just those two. And we're going to be adding a lot more variation to this and more control between the soil layer and the ecosystem, so that we don't have to render ambient occlusion or anything. We can have dense patches of grass make automatically basically look like there's a shadow or a darker area within the soil. We're going to be creating a few more variations and customizing the ecosystem.